Sometimes an actor's raw talent and chameleon-like acting ability allows them to portray anyone and anything on the stage and screen, and that is not what we're talking about today. Jim Carrey, born James Eugene Carrey, started his life in 1962 in the suburbs of Toronto. He started stand-up in his early teens, mostly doing impression work. He spent the 70s building a name for himself in the Canadian stand-up circuit, where he'd go on to build a sizable following. By the time he burst onto the American movie scene and became a comedy icon in the 90s, he'd already been performing for nearly 2 decades. It was a long, slow climb to the top, at least in America. He found early success in Canada, with a few starring roles even in Canadian movies and shows, and he was generally well-liked. It was a struggle to break into the American market that took so long. It wasn't until 1994 that most people in American movie audiences would be introduced to Jim Carrey. But his actual movie debut happened way back in 1981 with the made-for-TV Canadian movie Introducing Janet. In it, Carrey played a struggling stand-up comedian, a role that was pretty spot on for him at the time. It didn't win any awards, obviously, but if you were to watch it today, you'd see it's definitely Jim Carrey, the same one we'd grow to love. The name of the movie would later be changed to Rubberface when Carrey hit it big, I guess hoping to capitalize on his popularity later on. And the ball kept rolling for him, at least in Canada. In 1983, he had a few tiny parts in a few more Canadian movies, nothing really noteworthy, except maybe a pretty weird variety show called The Sex and Violence Family Hour, which he's only in for maybe a minute. It's funny, but definitely not family-friendly. He was also in the movie All in Good Taste. He doesn't even have any speaking lines, but he is credited. During this time, he was working to make his way into Hollywood, auditioning for everything he could, even earning a lead role in an NBC sitcom called The Duck Factory in 1984. In the end, the show only had 13 episodes, and you can go and watch them all on YouTube now. It didn't go anywhere, but it did let him live his dream of performing on The Tonight Show for Johnny Carson, something he'd been working towards since the beginning. Also that year, he was cast in his first big Hollywood movie with 1984's Finders Keepers. And it was not a good movie, and it didn't perform well either, losing almost $6 million at the box office. He'd get another chance though, this time snagging the lead role in another Hollywood movie, the 1985 horror comedy Once Bitten. Now this is the first time we get to see his sillier side in a Hollywood production, and it's not a bad movie. It's filled with that cheesy mid-80s charms you'd see in something like Weird Science or Real Genius. Critics didn't care much for it, of course, but it did okay at the box office, earning $10 million on a $3 million budget, giving Carrey his first real taste of success in the movies. He followed that with a bit part in Peggy Sue Got Married, which is notable mainly for the scene of him singing with a young Nick Cage. After that, he spent a few more years bouncing around the comedy club circuit, repeatedly auditioning for the cast of Saturday Night Live, something that he desperately wanted but never got a chance to do. In 1988, he'd show up in his first, albeit small, dramatic role with the Clint Eastwood movie The Deadpool. Even though his role was small, seeing Jim Carrey lip-syncing Welcome to the Jungle was not something I expected when I watched this movie as I got older. That same year, though, gave us the cult classic Earth Girls Are Easy. And while it was a critical and commercial bust, the cult following around it was massive. Most people think of this as the first big movie for Jim Carrey. More importantly, though, one of his co-stars, Damon Wayans, would play a big part in the next stage of his career. Before that, though, in 1989, he'd pop up as a background character in another Eastwood movie, this time with a pretty unforgettable Elvis impression. Then it was 1990, and after a decade of trying and failing to land a role on Saturday Night Live, he was finally offered a role on an American variety show. This one a competitor to SNL called In Living Color. It was being put together by his old co-star Damon Wayans and his brother. Fox was hoping to capture a younger, hipper audience, and the Wayans were as young and hip as you could get in the 90s. In Living Color would go on for 5 seasons, and all things considered was a pretty big hit, and Jim Carrey was there from the very beginning. Over the next couple years, outside of a few small parts here and there, it seemed like maybe he was done, and he was going to stick with TV for a while. That couldn't have been further from the truth, though. The steady paycheck and exposure from a successful television show gave him financial security, something he had been looking for. And that allowed him to devote all of his free time to his movie career. And that was time well spent. Because in February of 1994, we'd be introduced to one of the most iconic characters in movie history. And coincidentally, one of Jim Carrey's absolute best. And that would be Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. It was his performance on In Living Color that initially got him the role, but it was his on-set improvisation and over-the-top performance as Ace that would cement him as a legitimate movie star. To call Ace Ventura a massive success would be an understatement. It went on to earn over $100 million on a budget of only $15 million. It didn't stop there, though, because in the summer of 1994, his next movie would be the one to make him into a household name, and another one of his absolute best, The Mask. The Mask is based on a Dark Horse comic, and Carrey's performance in this movie was forever burned in the mind of kids from the 90s, and adults too. The critical response was amazing, especially considering the subject matter, and the box office draw was enough to put him in league with the other huge movie stars of the day. In fact, until The Joker came out in 2019, The Mask was considered the most profitable comic book movie of all time, something that's hard to fathom with the billion-dollar franchises we'd had in the intervening years. The Mask ended up making an astounding $351 million on a budget of $23 million. That's a mind-blowing figure for the time. And today. He still wasn't done though, because by December of '94, a third Jim Carrey movie would come out. This time, he'd star alongside Jeff Daniels in a movie that would forever change how the world would see both actors. The 1994 buddy comedy Dumb and Dumber. This was the first of the Farrelly Brothers movies, and not the last time Carrey had worked with the comedy legends. It was an instant hit with an endlessly quotable writing, dozens of memorable gags, and tons of jokes that land even today. It was another huge box office winner, bringing in an astounding $246 million on a $17 million budget. By the time 1994 was over, Jim Carrey was officially a household name, and a favorite of kids and young adults all over the world. When 1995 came around, he was riding pretty high. He was the second highest grossing movie star in the world, right behind Tom Hanks, and Tom Hanks was coming off of Forrest Gump and Apollo 13 and even Toy Story, three massive moneymakers. And understandably, Jim Carrey felt like he could do no wrong. And he was half right, because summer 1995 would see him in his next big role. Actually, another comic book movie, this one starring as the Riddler in Joel Schumacher's Batman Forever. And I can say, with all honesty, as a kid in the 90s, this was a lot of fun. Looking back, I can see why all the critics and adults and comic book fans were so upset about it. It was loud and over the top and not very Batman, but at the time I was all in. The one thing that critics and most moviegoers agreed on was that Jim Carrey, and for his part Tommy Lee Jones, really carried this movie along. Even with the abysmal critical reception and the generally poor reviews, Batman Forever still managed to pull in over $300 million. Now that's not quite as impressive as Carrey's work from the previous year, especially on a $100 million budget, but it's not really a bomb by any metric. November of 1995, he'd returned to the character that started him on his road to superstardom in the first place, in Ace Ventura When Nature Calls. And it was good. It obviously didn't have the same edginess as the first one, it leaned more into family-friendly affair, but Carrey still nailed the character despite the new setting and some of the more over-the-top set pieces. It cost more than double what the first Ace Ventura had to make at $30 million, but that was fine because it also managed to make double what the first one had made, with $212 million in returns, adding another hit to his already impressive resume. The next year would give us another of Carrey's absolute best, in 1996's The Cable Guy. Now, compared to his previous movies, The Cable Guy barely scratched the surface in terms of box office earnings, but the cultural impact was no less profound. Despite poor critical reception, audiences seemed to love the dark tone and Carrey's insane but pitiable portrayal. The Cable Guy would go on to garner a massive cult following that's still going strong to this day, and earned over $100 million on its $47 million budget. And that's not bad at all, but still a far cry from the numbers he'd pulled in before. And then 1997 was here, and that would give us another of his absolute best, this time playing the lawyer Fletcher Reed in the comedy Liar Liar. This was another massive hit for Carrey, and the critical response matched the box office receipts. Generally speaking, this was his highest rated movie so far. His ability to deliver semi-serious subject matter in a hilarious way, and the way he stole every scene he was in, put this one over the top. It cost a hefty $45 million to make, but raked in over $300 million in earnings. And then 1998 gave us his first dive into a semi-serious dramatic acting with The Truman Show. This ended up being his best reviewed film yet, riding on that deep and thought-provoking story and Carrey's performance. If Cable Guy hadn't been enough to prove to people that he was capable of playing a serious, sympathetic character that still delivered laughs, then The Truman Show definitely proved it. It'd make over $260 million on its $60 million budget. The next year, 1999, would give him his first legitimate bomb as a leading man. The Andy Kaufman biopic Man on the Moon. And though the critical and audience reception was terrible, it was generally agreed that Carrey did a pretty good job in the role. He brought the larger-than-life character to life with an eerie portrayal. It ended up making only $47 million on the back of an $82 million budget. The year 2000 would see him rejoining the Farrelly Brothers to get back to his comedy roots with the hit movie Me, Myself, and Irene. In it, Carrey does a fantastic job, essentially playing two characters as a schizophrenic with rage issues. The entire cast was great, but Carrey understandably stole the show. The entire movie's hilarious and infinitely quotable. Despite middling reviews, it still managed to pull in a respectable $149 million, and that's not bad on a budget of $51. To close out the new millennium, 2000's holiday season would treat us to Carrey's first outing in a movie geared towards children, Ron Howard's adaptation of the Dr. Seuss classic How the Grinch Stole Christmas. This was the first of his movies to pull in an Academy Award, though it was for makeup, and the critical reception was not great. Critics universally seemed to agree, though, that Jim Carrey was amazing as the Grinch. Even though the critics didn't love the movie, it still managed to pull in over $345 million with a $123 million budget. And more importantly, it earned a place in our living rooms every Christmas for the rest of the time. 2001 and 2002 were slow years for Mr. Carrey, his only outing being his first 100% dramatic role in 2001's The Majestic. And the movie was interesting. I'll be honest and say that I've been a lifelong Jim Carrey fan, and it took me 20 years to watch this movie. It was interesting seeing this guy made me laugh my entire life, spent 2 hours trying to make me cry. In his credit, his performance was amazing, award-worthy even, but the movie itself was not. Not at all, and the box office results proved it, earning only $37 million on the back of a $72 million budget. Now, after The Majestic bombed, he took a year off. I think he knew he needed to come back in a big way, so he spent that time looking for the perfect movie to win audiences back, and he found it, giving us another of his absolute best with 2003's Bruce Almighty. This was him dipping his toes back into the comedy water after a foray into drama didn't work out, and it was amazing. He did a great job playing a lovable and at the same time hateable news reporter, Bruce. The way he sells the emotions and the perfect timing really set this movie over the top. And despite average reviews, Bruce Almighty would go on to gross nearly $500 million, a staggering figure for the time, and still in 2022 the highest grossing film of his career. 2004 would see him once again returning to the dramatic side of the aisle, with the incredibly weird, romantic, dramedy, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And it was pretty good. It was a movie carried entirely by the actors, with both Jim Carrey and his co-star Kate Winslet doing a fantastic job. Winslet was even nominated for an Academy Award, and the movie itself would go on to win the award for Best Screenplay. For his part, Carrey was nominated for a Golden Globe. The movie was near universally praised by critics and viewers alike, and has since garnered a cult following. Even so, it was a far cry from the massive blockbusters it had been making, earning only $70 million on its $20 million budget. He then go on to try his hand at another children's movie, this time playing the main antagonist Count Olaf in the 2004 movie A Series of Unfortunate Events. This movie was praised by critics and moviegoers alike for its beautiful art direction and Carrey's hilariously manic turn as the evil Count Olaf. The movie would perform pretty well too, pulling in $211 million, though the production cost had leapt to over $140 million by the time it had wrapped, cutting into the profits. 2005 would give us his next comedic outing in Fun with Dick and Jane, a comedy with a message. Despite wonderful performances by Carrey and his co-star Tia Leone, critics came down pretty hard on this movie. The consensus seemed to be that the movie could never decide if it wanted to be a comedy or to send a message. And despite the critical reception, the movie would end with a respectable $204 million on a $100 million budget. 2007 would give us Carrey and the psychological thriller The Number 23, and this movie was crazy.